السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل الوباء المستمر إلى جانب الفقدان الكبير للوظائف والركود الطويل وعبء الديون غير المسبوق سيخلق حتما توترات اجتماعية داخل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، والتي من المحتمل أن تتحول إلى رد فعل سياسي عنيف. هو صيف حار وغاضب وطويل، ومع ذلك فإن انهيار الثقة بالقيادة والخوف من الاضطرابات الاجتماعية يمكن أن يزرعا مرضا أكثر عمقا، يمكن أن تنتج الحالة الروحية التي أطلق عليها عالم الاجتماع الفرنسي إيميل دوركهايم اسم الشذوذ، أي الافتقار إلى المعايير الاجتماعية أو الأخلاقية المعتادة في الفرد أو المجموعة، شعوراً بالانفصال عن المجتمع واقتناعاً بأن العالم من حول المرء غير شرعي وفاسد، بأنه غير مرئي، أنه رقم وكائناً عاجزاً ذا شعور بأنه لا يمكن الوثوق بأحد. لقد تغير مزاج الأمريكيين بشكل كبير، مائلا أكثر نحو التشاؤم، إذ أظهر استطلاع تلو الآخر أن الأمريكيين أقل تفاؤلا بكثير مما كانوا عليه خلال النصف الأول من عام 2021، ما ستكون له آثار سيئة على الاقتصاد. يقول 45% من الأمريكيين بحسب أحد استطلاعات الرأي الآن إن وضع فيروس كورونا في الولايات المتحدة يزداد سوءاً، ويتوقع 42% أن تمتد الاضطرابات المجتمعية المتعلقة بكوفيد-19 إلى ما بعد العام الجديد. ووجدت دراسة استقصائية مختلفة أن تصنيف قبول بايدن قد انخفض ما مجموعه 10 نقاط منذ حزيران يونيو المنصرم. يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من ولاية إلينوي الأمريكية برانكو مارتشيتييش، المؤلف والكاتب في مجلة جاكوبن، حيث نقرأ في كتابه الأخير رجل الأمس، القضية ضد جو بايدن، ونلقي نظرة عميقة إلى تاريخ الرجل وأصول قيمه السياسية، ونطلع على مراكز الأبحاث وتأثيرها في قرار قادة البلاد والسياسات، ولا سيما الخارجية منها. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل، معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. برانكو مارتشيتييش, author and staff writer at Jacobin magazine, joining us from the US state of Illinois. Welcome to من الداخل from the inside, Branko.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you always. Well, yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden, is your recent book published in January in 2020, which is a deep dive into Joe Biden's history and the origins of his political values. Why do you think that Biden, the United States' longest-serving politician, is one of its least scrutinized? What have you exposed in your book, Branko?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think he kind of flew under the radar. Even when he was picked to be Obama's vice president, which is really what most people know him from, he didn't have a very high profile before then. People, did not really know that much about him when he was picked, and he was a bit of a cipher. I think people mostly kind of associated him with a kind of folksiness. They thought he was charming and they thought he was funny. They didn't necessarily think of him as a policy heavyweight necessarily. But he was someone who was, I think, more known for his personality, his very affable personality, at least publicly. And I think that kind of allowed him to skate under a lot of the deeper scrutiny that a lot of politicians started getting. And to be honest, I think the other thing is that the kind of really intense examinations of politicians' histories, that wasn't so much being done, even in the 2000s. I mean, Obama, people barely knew anything about Obama's history, even though if they had looked at, financial connections and where he got his money from and some of his rise, through Chicago and in the state legislature in Illinois, they may have known a few more things about him that kind of explained who he was when he became president. But people were more drawn to the kind of personality side of that. So I think it's a couple of different things, but that's probably why he was able to kind of miss out on really having people examine his history. One of the things I tried to show in the book, one of the things I tried to argue is that Biden, even though he's a Democrat, he's always been on the conservative side of the Democratic Party. He ran initially as a kind of New Deal liberal, so kind of the liberal in the style of Franklin Roosevelt back in the 1930s and 40s. But when politics in the United States shifted in the 70s and early 80s, and things went into a more right-wing direction under Ronald Reagan and under Jimmy Carter, Biden really abandoned all that and shape-shifted. And that's where he was for a long time. What's kind of interesting is now that he's president in this very different era where you have coronavirus and so much else really changing the political terrain. He's actually kind of shifted back in some ways. He's the way he's governed is a little more to the left than he's been probably his entire career. But you still have that element of that original kind of more conservative Biden that tends to kind of fold in the face of right-wing pressure. And we saw that in certain key aspects. We saw that with his abandonment of the $15 minimum wage in the first reconciliation bill. We saw that with the way that he allowed Republican governors to illegally cut extended unemployment insurance, and some of the things around coronavirus, the abandonment of the mask mandate a couple of months ago that was pretty heavily criticized, and now I think people are kind of really waking up to how big of a mistake that was.
And the evictions and many other issues. So he shifted, and the mood of the Americans also has shifted. We will come to talk about the mood of the Americans, but allow me to ask you here something about something that you have written extensively into. The Center for New American Security, the CNAS, has long pushed Democrats to embrace war and militarism and advocated preemptive measures, and it also plays an influential role in the current Democratic administration. As a think tank with deep ties to the Democratic and national security establishments, tell us more, Branko, about the influence of the CNAS, this hawkish liberal think tank, powering various Democratic presidents, and how it managed to snake through and insert its influence into the halls of power, even under Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the CNAS initially came about in 2008. It was basically a kind of foreign policy administration in waiting for the Clinton presidency. They thought Hillary Clinton was going to win in 2008. And then when Obama ended up winning the primary, they basically got their way into Obama's good graces, and Obama drew on them to staff his administration. And you can see there was an early bit of influence on Obama from them in the way that he kind of abandoned his campaign pledge to get out of Iraq, and he went by the CNAS recommendation instead, which was to stay the course, temporarily, allegedly, without any sort of withdrawal date. And then there were several other things, for instance, Obama going into Syria eventually, for instance. There was also into Libya, into his support for the TPP. Those are all supported by the CNAS. And currently under Biden, the CNAS has, I believe, in February it was 16 people formerly in the CNAS are now in the Biden administration in various posts. So, the think tank has really put its stamp on the Biden administration. He has not done every single thing that they would have wanted to, but I think on one issue the influence is really clear, which is Biden's kind of posture of competing with China and taking kind of a more aggressive approach to China, which of course was a hallmark of Trump's policies, but one that has very neatly been folded into the new Democratic administration. And that's one thing that the CNAS has been pushing for pretty aggressively. I should also say, at the same time that the CNAS is doing all of this, they are getting funding from weapons manufacturers, defense contractors of various kinds. You know, people, for instance, private contractors who send troops, mercenaries into Afghanistan. And so there's a very big overlap between what the CNAS recommends as policy and then also the kinds of things that would benefit the people that give them money.
True. Well, the rules in Washington are simple, Branko. There can be little to no restrictions on the president's ability to bomb and brutalize foreigners. But when it comes to stopping mass evictions, executive power must be strictly restrained. Suddenly, the rule of law, as you say, matters. This is the perfect encapsulation of the logic and values of Washington. Concerning this particular issue, won't someone think about the children, the elderly?
Yeah, that was written in response to the eviction ban expiring. I mean, and as you say, that's a very good example of how some of Biden's conservative instincts are still there. You know, he ultimately did the right thing and extended the moratorium. But it took a lot of effort, a lot of pressure on the part of Democrats in Congress. Cori Bush, one of the new left-wing members of Congress who was elected in the last election, she actually slept on the steps of the Capitol for 5 days as a kind of protest to say, you know, this needs to be done to protect people. And yeah, you know, at the time, it was very mystifying to me why Biden would wait until the very last moment, until, you know, a few days until it was meant to expire, to basically kick the can to Congress and say, well, you know what, you guys have to do something about the eviction ban. You know, this was something that was coming for many days, for an entire month at the very least. And so I think that's a very good example of the way that, you know, even though Biden has been pushed left by the conditions on the ground, he still has a bit of that conservative nature. And as you say with that quote, you know, what that is referring to is the fact that there was a lot of outrage from some of the country's bigger newspapers. The Washington Post, the editorial board, criticized the eviction moratorium being extended. They basically said it was a violation of rule of law, which was a very debatable point. I don't agree that that's the case, but that's what they argued, and you know, a whole host of other commentators said the same thing. And there's such a stark contrast to the outrage that happens and the sort of this professed sanctity for the rule of law when it comes to protecting people from homelessness. You know, 11 to 15 million people from homelessness, compared to when, say, a president you know, wages war in Libya without getting any legal authorization from Congress, or when the president launches a global assassination campaign, in the process killing U.S. citizens. You know, then the rule of law seems to not be quite as important in Washington.
Well, it seems that the mood of the nation has dramatically changed. Survey after survey has shown Americans to be much less optimistic than they were during the first half of 2021, which will have implications for the economy. A survey just found that Biden's approval rating has dropped a total of 10 points since June. How do you explain that and why it matters?
Well, I think the big thing here is the resurgence of the coronavirus. You know, I think, unfortunately, the Biden administration declared, or didn't quite declare victory, but you know, basically signaled that victory was very near over the virus way too soon, back in, I think, June or July. And you know, not taking into account that, look, this virus from the very beginning, yes, we've been able to develop vaccines for it and do pretty tremendous things to get a handle on it, but it's always changing, it's mutating, and to be honest, the way that the pandemic response, not just nationally in the United States but globally, has been done, it's really all but ensured that something like this would happen, because I think at this point, you know, I think less than a percent of the populations of the poorest countries in the world have gotten vaccines. It's all been these vaccines have been hoarded by wealthy countries, which are also very reluctant to give up the patent rights on these vaccines and allow them to be generically manufactured and more cheaply manufactured for poorer countries to get. And so what that means is that if the virus is running rampant in much of the rest of the globe, in the poorer parts of the globe and elsewhere, that means there's more chances for it to mutate, to become more dangerous, to become more contagious, and to even evade the vaccine. And to some extent, we may be seeing that. There's a new variant called the Lambda variant.
Sure.
That one study has said that it's resistant to the vaccine. I think we'll have to see. That's not 100% yet. But this is a reminder of the kind of thing that can happen if we look at this pandemic as just a purely individual, nationalistic kind of project, and not as a global project where making sure that every single person, from the poorest people in the world to the richest, are inoculated is a defense for all of us from the pandemic.
Right.
And so I think that is what's happening.
But concerning the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, when intelligence and training troops would remain to presumably assist Iraqi forces by redefining the role of some of the American troops in the country, rather than reducing the number of troops, doesn't that, Branko, confirm the perception in the U.S. of a weakening America on its incremental way out from the Middle East?
Yeah, well, there was a big hullabaloo around the fact that Biden, when he announced the Afghanistan withdrawal, he also talked about moving more to confront China, which has its own problems, but it did seem to signal maybe a change away from the failed war on terror approach of the last 20 years. But as you say, this kind of accounting trickery, where they've essentially left the same amount of troops in Iraq, a country that the US was meant to have withdrawn from, at this point nearly a decade ago, by the way. They've done this accounting trick to keep troops, and it does suggest that less of the war, the war on terror is staying in place more than I think people would have assumed or liked to see. At the same time, I should give Biden credit. I'm very critical of the administration, but credit where credit's due. He has stuck to his guns and withdrawing from Afghanistan, and that's happening under an enormous amount of domestic pressure. The U.S. media and a lot of the more kind of hawkish elements of Washington.
But don't you think that the Iraqi resistance has also exerted massive pressure on the American troops there in Iraq?
Oh, for sure. And I mean, and the same thing in Afghanistan. I mean, I think it's key to understand that the U.S. is a very powerful country. It has the world's largest military. It has, I think the second most nuclear weapons in the world. It's a very, very, in terms of what it can do to inflict pain and to destroy, it's incredibly powerful. But these are things that cannot be solved by brute force alone. They cannot be solved just by bombing these problems away. And that, I think with Iraq and Afghanistan and a lot of the Middle East, they require political solutions. And I think that's one of the things that the United States in the last let's say 20 years has kind of really given up or downplayed things like diplomacy and a lot of these more kind of soft solutions in favor of more aggression, more military.
Yes.
And that's what you get.
Right. In a similar vein, the U.S. unilateral coercive measures were designed from the outset to produce economic havoc as a way to foment popular discontent, to politicize hunger in the hope that, driven by despair and motivated by want, the Cuban people would rise up to topple the government. Now, as I did this introductory question, one might think that, well, I'm talking about Iraq, I'm talking about Lebanon, I'm talking about Syria, but it's the same policy that is being also followed in Cuba. Why the 6-decade genocidal policy of U.S. blockade on Cuba must end, Branko?
Well, I mean, in the United States and around the world, we've been hearing calls for Biden and others to support the Cuban people because they're protesting against the government right now. And so this entire thing is couched in concern for the Cuban people. If you really are concerned for the Cuban people, if you believe that their interests and their safety is the most important thing, well, invading Cuba is not going to be the answer, as we've seen with a dozen other regime change examples.
Like in Iran, too.
Yeah, yep, Iraq, Libya. I mean, all of these things end up being for the worse for the actual people themselves. However, one thing that the United States could very easily do, if it really cares about the Cuban people, is to remove this blockade, which has been causing human suffering for way before even these protests right now, way before COVID really amped up the economic and health strain on the country. For, as you say, for decades now, this policy has been making life miserable for ordinary Cubans, depriving them of medicine, basic medicines, depriving them of sometimes being able to easily have contact with their families, depriving them of critical remittances they're sent from family that they have overseas, and so much else. It really strangling its economy. The problem there is that policymakers in the United States will not do that because, despite the fact that all of this is couched in a concern for the Cuban people, that's not really what it's about. The concern is about getting rid of the Cuban government that's in place in Cuba. And the Cuban people are an instrument that I think U.S. policymakers view as something they can use to get rid of the government. If they make people hungry and desperate enough and sick enough, eventually they will get frustrated and possibly overthrow the regime. That was why the blockade was put in place. It was very openly said by the people who put it in place. Eisenhower himself said it. In the 90s, when we saw similar scenes of Cuba because of the economic crisis that was happening there, as the United States tightened those sanctions in those years, you had a right-wing think tank like the Heritage Foundation celebrating this. They were saying this is fantastic. That families, mothers are turning to prostitution, and that families can barely eat a meal a day. This is great because eventually they will get so angry they will overthrow the Cuban government.
Right, you have made that point very clear. Branko Mártchitiéš, staff writer at Jacobin magazine, the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. Thank you very much, Branko, for joining us for this thorough talk and analysis.
Thank you for having me.
Bless you and be safe. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.